Today, perhaps more than ever, women carry the weight of unseen betrayals, silent rejections, and the echoing voices of hearts broken in the dark. The shadow of another's cruelty, another's negligence, can linger long after the words are gone, leaving a trail of doubt, resentment, and fragmented selfhood. In the quiet of night, when the mind drifts through memory like a restless tide, the question arises: how does one forgive when the act itself seems unworthy of mercy, when the heart screams yet the soul whispers caution? Forgiveness, in its truest Jungian sense, is not a surrender to weakness, nor a feigned erasure of injustice. It is the conscious alchemy of transforming the poisoned wound into a crucible for individuation, the sacred task of reclaiming the self from the labyrinth of ego projections and unconscious entanglements. She who has been wronged learns slowly that anger is not an enemy to vanquish, but a messenger revealing the unhealed corners of the psyche. Every pang of resentment illuminates the dark recesses of her own shadow, the parts of her identity that cling to control, validation, or revenge. To forgive in silence is to see the perpetrator not merely as a villain, but as a mirror reflecting the unresolved patterns within herself. To look, without flinching, at the traits she despises in another is to confront the aspects of her own nature she has denied. The audacity of the human spirit lies in this confrontation, in embracing the duality of victim and observer, pain and insight, hurt and liberation. Forgiveness is not performed in grand declarations or public absolution. It is enacted quietly, beneath the skin where no one observes, where no applause can validate the act. In this private theater of the psyche, she learns the language of detachment, the discipline of witnessing the past without being possessed by it. Stoic philosophy whispers here, he who angers you controls you. The man who dismissed her, the partner who betrayed, the friend who abandoned, none of them hold dominion unless she grants it. And yet to simply suppress anger is insufficient. The fire must burn, transformed into warmth, radiating insight instead of ire. The process demands courage. Every memory of pain is an invitation to excavate the unconscious, to confront the myths she has inherited about worthiness and love. She must walk through the ruins of expectation, shedding the illusions that another's choices define her value. In the tender stillness of introspection, she discovers that forgiveness is an act of sovereignty, a declaration that her soul will not be hostage to the actions of others. It is the paradoxical embrace of both grief and grace, the conscious choice to release the hand that clutches at betrayal and, in doing so, to touch the infinite freedom within herself. Notice how the world often equates forgiveness with weakness, yet the Jungian archetype of the wise woman knows differently. To forgive in silence is to inhabit a space untouched by opinion, untethered from the judgment of the collective. It is to move forward while carrying the wisdom of the past without dragging its bitterness. Can you feel the weight lift? Not because the other deserves it, but because you have chosen it? To forgive silently is to honor your own evolution, to allow the psyche to unfold like a dark lotus blooming in the void, revealing beauty that only comes from shadow and patience. She steps into this inner sanctum with deliberate grace, aware that the journey towards silent forgiveness is neither linear nor tidy. It is a spiral descent into memory and sensation, where echoes of old wounds rise like ghosts and demand acknowledgement. Each encounter with pain is a reflection, a psychic fingerprint left upon her soul, insisting that she witness without distortion. To surrender to the urge for retaliation or recrimination is to remain tethered to the very source of suffering she seeks to transcend. And yet, the lure of this reactive energy is seductive. The mind whispers of justice, of payback, of the fleeting satisfaction of making the world see her agony. But she, guided by the archetypal feminine wisdom, recognizes these impulses for what they are: projections of the ego's need for control, illusions that would keep her bound. The silent forgiveness she cultivates does not absolve the wrongdoer. He may remain blind, indifferent, or even hostile. His recognition is irrelevant. What matters is the reclamation of her own authority over the psychic space he once occupied. By stepping outside the compulsive loop of hurt and blame, she erects a sanctuary within herself, a realm where her energy is sovereign and undiluted by external chaos. Carl Jung would observe that this act is an essential component of individuation, the integration of shadow and light, of wound and wisdom, into a cohesive self that no longer requires validation from those who could not honor her. There is, within this practice, a profound encounter with the unconscious masculine, the part of the psyche that has been conditioned to defend, retaliate, or dominate surfaces as she confronts betrayal and disappointment. But the feminine, tempered with the insight of experience, does not respond with the reflexive violence of ego. She observes, she notes, she names, but she does not act out of compulsion. She allows the tension to exist, recognizing it as a signal of her own boundaries and unmet needs, rather than as a weapon to be wielded against another. This is the quiet strength that is often mistaken for passivity, but is, in truth, the embodiment of power. Trauma, too, becomes a teacher rather than a tormentor. The psyche remembers in fragments, in flashes of shame, anger, and sorrow. Yet each recollection is a portal into understanding herself more fully. She discerns patterns, recognizes recurring entanglements, and illuminates the unconscious beliefs that have made her vulnerable to pain. Forgiveness, in this context, is an act of reclaiming narrative authority. She decides what meaning the past holds, what lessons it imparts, and how it shapes the woman she chooses to become. No longer is she a passive subject in the stories written by others. She is the author of her own inner epic. And so, the act of moving on is not a denial of memory, but a conscious restructuring of psychic architecture. To forgive silently is to dissolve the chains of resentment without erasing the lessons learned, to lift the gaze from the horizon of blame and fix it instead upon the landscape of self-knowledge. It is the recognition that true freedom is cultivated within, that peace is not granted by external reconciliation, but claimed through inner mastery. Can you hear the quiet pulse of power, the steady rhythm of a soul that refuses to be diminished by another's actions? This is the crucible in which a woman becomes whole, unshakable, and luminous. In the sacred space of her interior world, she begins to notice the subtle architecture of resentment, the intricate ways it coils around memory, around the narratives she has repeated to herself 1,000 times. Every recollection of hurt carries with it a tangle of self-blame, a whisper that perhaps she was too trusting, too open, too vulnerable. Jung would call this the interplay of the personal and collective shadow, the way unresolved wounds echo across lifetimes, across the archetypal patterns that govern human attachment and betrayal. To forgive in silence is to disentangle these threads without judgment, to allow the psyche to see itself as it truly is, layered, wounded, yet capable of astonishing resilience. She learns that silence is not absence, it is a forceful presence. In speaking her forgiveness aloud, she might inadvertently tether herself again to the energy of the one who wronged her, inviting dialogue, explanation, or denial that is unnecessary and potentially destructive. The power of silent forgiveness lies in its refusal to seek external validation. The act is internal, sovereign, and irreversible. She chooses peace over vindication, mastery over rage, and in doing so, she erects an invisible fortress around her own soul. Every whispered thought of retaliation, every imagined confrontation is observed, acknowledged, and then released. She becomes a witness to her own process, not a prisoner of her own emotions. There is a strange liberation in this quiet reclamation. The mind, once a battlefield of anger and longing, begins to settle into a rhythm reminiscent of meditation or ritualized reflection. She may notice the subtle tremors of trauma dissolving, replaced by a clarity that feels both alien and familiar. Her inner world, once overrun by the shadows of others' actions, gradually becomes a sanctuary of insight. The more she sits with the tension, the more the ego's compulsive need for revenge diminishes, and the more she senses the untouchable core of her being, the self that no external betrayal can penetrate. This is the alchemy of the soul, the transformation of suffering into wisdom, of pain into agency. The psychological depth of this journey cannot be overstated. Every attempt to hold on to resentment, every fantasy of teaching them a lesson, is a projection of unmet needs and unconscious patterns. By choosing silent forgiveness, she disarms the very mechanisms that perpetuate her suffering. The past is honored, not weaponized. The wound is acknowledged, not inflated. She cultivates a form of self-respect that is impermeable, rooted in the knowledge that her value is inherent, not contingent upon another's recognition. Stoic echoes remind her, "No man can harm you without your consent." Her silence becomes a mirror of this truth, a refusal to grant power to that which does not serve her evolution. Perhaps the most radical aspect of this practice is its defiance of expectation. The world anticipates drama, confrontation, and emotional exhibition. It expects that wrongs will be answered in kind. Yet she moves contrary to the predictable, embodying a form of empowerment that is both invisible and inviolable. In the quiet unfolding of her psyche, she realizes that forgiveness is less an act toward another and more an act of fidelity to herself. Every moment she holds her peace, she cements a boundary around her spirit, one that no apology, no denial, no external measure can breach. She becomes both the calm observer and the sovereign participant in her own life, a woman whose freedom is neither conferred nor contested, but self-declared. She comes to understand that moving on is less about leaving the past behind and more about reweaving the threads of her present so that the past no longer dictates her movement. In the shadowed corridors of memory, she discovers that each betrayal, each slight, each abandonment was never truly about her worth. It was about the unresolved projections of others, their own unintegrated shadows, their unexamined fears. And yet she has carried their unconscious burdens long enough, mistaking them for wounds inflicted upon her essence. In forgiving silently, she disentangles her energy from theirs, reclaiming space that has been encroached upon for far too long. The liberation is subtle at first, a quiet shift in posture, a lightening of thought, a softening in the chest where constriction once dwelled. This is where the inner work deepens. Shadow integration demands that she confront not only the darkness in others, but the darkness in herself. She notices the resentment she harbored toward those who hurt her, but also the guilt she carried for imagining herself small. the shame for believing she was unworthy of love or respect. Here, the archetype of the wise woman becomes both guide and witness, offering the steady, unwavering presence that observes without judgment. To forgive silently is to enter this internal dialogue with courage and honesty, recognizing that the capacity to forgive is inseparable from the capacity to love and honor oneself. The silence is the voice of sovereignty, the absence of reaction, the signature of her empowerment. Emotionally, this journey is both exhausting and exhilarating. The mind resists relinquishing its narratives of grievance, whispering that forgiveness is surrender. Yet she knows, through repeated introspection and confrontation with her shadow, that forgiveness is the ultimate assertion of freedom. It is a refusal to remain bound by the strings of someone else's choices. It is an internal declaration. I am not beholden to your decisions, your cruelty, or your negligence. My life is mine to command, and in that declaration lies an audacious, almost rebellious joy. The realization that no external event, however painful, can dictate the rhythm of her inner world unless she allows it. As she moves through this process, she begins to notice a profound shift in desire and attention. The compulsive need for approval, for validation, for recompense diminishes. She no longer seeks acknowledgement from those who once wronged her, nor does she linger in the spaces where judgment might arise. The energy she once expended in bitterness is redirected into creation, the creation of self, the creation of boundaries, the creation of a life aligned with her highest values. There is a precision to this freedom, a clarity in which she can observe her past, acknowledge it, and then step beyond it without hesitation. In the external world, nothing may change. The people who caused pain may remain unchanged, indifferent or unaware of the transformation unfolding within her. But this is irrelevant. True liberation does not rely upon reciprocity. It relies upon self-possession. The act of silent forgiveness is a sovereign gesture, unseen yet monumental. It is the reclamation of time, of attention, of psychic territory that was once ceded to anger and despair. In the stillness of reflection, she discovers that the wounds which once seemed to define her have become the instruments of her awakening, the crucible through which she tempers resilience, wisdom, and profound self-respect. With each passing day, the contours of her inner world shift, subtle yet irrevocable. The weight of past grievances no longer anchors her. It becomes a kind of ballast she can release at will, a lesson encoded in experience rather than a chain to drag her backward. In this process, she learns that forgiveness in silence is not a moment but a practice, a continuous, almost ritualized engagement with her own psyche. She observes the lingering tendrils of anger or sorrow and allows them to arise fully, naming them not as enemies but as messengers of her unmet needs, unhealed patterns, and latent strengths. This conscious witnessing is where empowerment crystallizes. She is no longer reactive but intentional, no longer subject to the tides of emotion, but a navigator of their currents. There is a sacred interplay between shadow and light here. The shadow, the repository of unresolved emotion, pain, and unmet desire, is not to be banished but understood. Each flash of bitterness or self-doubt is a reflection of an unintegrated part of her being, a signpost pointing toward wholeness. Jung spoke of the necessity of confronting the shadow to achieve individuation, and in forgiving silently, she performs this confrontation without external drama or spectacle. She allows the dark to exist alongside the luminous aspects of her soul, recognizing that power arises not from the absence of shadow, but from the conscious engagement with it. She becomes, in essence, both observer and alchemist, transforming psychic lead into golden insight. Emotionally, this yields a quiet authority. No longer does she chase the approval of others or hinge her sense of worth upon their acknowledgement. The betrayal that once seemed like a defining scar is now a lesson etched in the marrow of her resilience. She recognized the pattern. The actions of others are projections of their own fears and deficiencies. Her freedom is in refusing to internalize these projections, in holding her own psychic space, with the steadfastness of one who knows her own value. The act of silent forgiveness is thus a radical declaration of self-sovereignty. She is unbound, unmanipulated, unclaimed by the energies that do not serve her evolution. This journey also sharpens discernment. She sees the difference between genuine connection and entanglement, between reciprocal affection and egoic need. Her past pain becomes a lens through which she can detect insincerity, manipulation, or unconscious projection in others without bitterness. She does not wield this discernment as a weapon. She wields it as a shield, preserving her energy, her attention, and her sense of self. In this way, forgiveness in silence is not weakness. It is the cultivation of an inviolable field of psychic integrity. Eventually, the echoes of pain fade, not because they are forgotten, but because they are contextualized. They exist as memories, not mandates. She moves through the world with a poise born of internal mastery, unshaken by slights, unhooked from resentment, attuned instead to her own values and rhythms. The act of letting go, of silently forgiving, has granted her something few realized they could claim: the authority to define her inner world, to set the terms of her engagement with life, to walk forward unburdened by the weight of others' shadows. It is a liberation so complete that it feels like rebirth, a quiet eruption of sovereignty that radiates from the marrow to the fingertips, a testament to the power of introspection, courage, and unwavering self-respect. In the unfolding of this inner emancipation, she begins to recognize that silence itself is a teacher. Words often serve as traps, binding the speaker to expectation, to argument, to defense. By refraining from verbal absolution, she places herself beyond the reach of judgment, beyond the cycles of justification and retaliation. Her silence is a fortress, but also a river, flowing, adaptive, persistent. It carries away the residue of anger, leaving clarity in its wake. Every memory of betrayal, every pang of grief, becomes a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. She understands, in the marrow of her bones, that forgiveness is less an act toward another and more an act of fidelity to the self. There is an archetypal rhythm to this transformation. The wounded feminine within her does not vanish. It speaks quietly, urging acknowledgement of its pain. The wise feminine answers, tender yet firm, integrating the wound without being consumed by it. This dialogue between shadow and wisdom is the crucible of individuation, the realization that wholeness does not demand perfection, nor does liberation require the obliteration of memory. The past is neither enemy nor friend. It is a teacher, a map, a reference point from which she charts her sovereignty. In embracing this dialogue, she discovers that true power lies not in reaction, but in restraint, not in conquest, but in mastery of the self. Psychologically, this process rewires the circuitry of expectation. She no longer seeks validation from those who failed to honor her. She no longer waits for apologies that may never come. Her energy, once fragmented by grief and outrage, coalesces into a coherent field of presence. She becomes magnetic not because she demands attention, but because she inhabits her own power fully, without apology, without compromise. In this state, forgiveness is not a concession. It is a declaration. I am whole despite what you have done. I am sovereign, and my peace is not negotiable. Even the residues of anger and grief when they arise are treated as emissaries rather than enemies. She observes them, listens to their message, and lets them pass. In this dynamic, she discovers the intimate connection between emotion and insight. The darker impulses are not to be repressed, but recognized, understood, and transformed. Shadow work is not comfortable. It is a labor of courage, a confrontation with parts of the self that have been denied or feared. Yet through this labor, she cultivates an internal terrain where forgiveness and freedom coexist, where love for oneself becomes the lodestar, guiding every interaction and choice. As the days accumulate, so too does the sense of liberation. The chains of resentment dissolve in the quiet exertion of deliberate mindfulness and conscious choice. She moves through life lighter, not oblivious to injustice, but untethered from its dominion. Each step forward is imbued with clarity, each breath a testament to the power of self-possession. She has discovered that the measure of her strength is not found in the suffering she endured, but in the sovereignty she claims in response. In silent forgiveness, she has not only released the weight of others' actions, but has discovered the profound, unassailable freedom of a soul that knows itself fully. The culmination of this journey reveals itself not in dramatic gestures or sudden epiphanies, but in the subtle, persistent hum of inner authority. She walks through the world with a stillness that commands attention without demanding it. Others may remain unaware of the transformation that has occurred within her, yet it radiates unmistakably. The quiet confidence of one who has weathered betrayal and emerged intact, refined, sovereign. Every encounter, every glance, every interaction is filtered through this lens of integrity. She no longer carries the burden of reactive emotion, nor does she allow the past to dictate the terms of her present. In this state, she understands that forgiveness and empowerment are inseparable. The act of forgiving silently is simultaneously an act of defiance and grace, a refusal to let another's immaturity or cruelty dictate her internal landscape. Jungian psychology would suggest that she has traversed the threshold of the personal unconscious into the collective unconscious, drawing from archetypal wells of feminine wisdom, resilience, and discernment. Her shadow is no longer a threat. It is a companion, a teacher, a reminder of her depth and capacity. Through this integration, she has transformed pain into insight, sorrow into autonomy, and anger into deliberate, unobtrusive power. The world continues to operate according to its own rhythms, oblivious to her inner work. The people who caused her suffering may remain unchanged, may never offer apology or recognition, yet this is no longer of consequence. Her sovereignty does not depend upon their acknowledgement. Stoic wisdom resonates here. The opinions, actions, and whims of others are outside her jurisdiction. Her only task is mastery of the self. In silently forgiving, she has disentangled her essence from their influence, claimed her inner territory, and declared without fanfare that her peace is hers to command. Emotionally, this freedom manifests in subtle yet profound ways. She no longer measures her value against the recognition of others, nor does she chase affection or approval that is inconsistent or conditional. The psychic energy, once bound in cycles of resentment and fixation, is now available for creation, for love, for life itself. Every choice she makes, every boundary she enforces, every act of self-care becomes an expression of sovereignty. She has learned that detachment from those who cannot honor her is not abandonment. It is a deliberate act of self-preservation, a conscious cultivation of a fertile inner world where growth, joy, and wisdom can flourish. Finally, in the stillness of this hard-won peace, she discovers the most profound truth. The act of forgiving silently is, ultimately, an act of self-liberation. She has allowed the past to inform her without enslaving her, to teach her without defining her, to illuminate her shadows without extinguishing her light. In this reclamation of power, she is reborn, untainted by betrayal, unburdened by grievance, untethered from the expectations of others. She moves forward with clarity, dignity, and a radiance born of quiet mastery. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.